Well, hello. Hi. On behalf of KPCC and LES and our events partner, the University of Redlands, thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Lynn Gross, a producer with KPCC in person. The University of Redlands has an amazing team who worked really, really hard to help make tonight happen, and we feel so honored to be here. So thank you so much. As most of you may know, KPCC and LES is a news organization, and we produce events just like the one tonight. On Monday, Air Talk's Larry Mantle will have a one-on-one conversation with Morning Edition's Steve Inskeep. And at the end of the month, we will be partnering with the LA Times for a live district attorney debate at the Aratani Theater. We'd love for you all to join us, and if you would like more information on these events or any of our other events, please feel free to go to kpcc.org/in-person. Just a couple other notes. We are live streaming tonight, so we ask that you do not audio or video record. If you are feeling inspired to take pictures, please do so. We just ask that you turn off your flash and please silence your phone. For those of you who are on social, we are using the hashtag ClimateChangeIE. I'd like to pass this off now to your host for the evening, KPCC's senior environment reporter, Emily Guerin.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me? I think we need to up the volume a little bit. How about now? Is that any better? Okay. I can't see you, but you can see me. So I'm Emily Guerin. I'm the environment reporter at KPCC, which in LA is 89.3. Out here, I gather it's 89.1. I'm also hosting a podcast that's coming out in a couple weeks, not about the environment. We can talk about that afterwards if you want. And I wanted to start by just telling you about this experience I had recently that, for me, really sums up sort of where we're at in Southern California with climate change right now. So I cover a lot of wildfires, and I was at the Tick Fire in Santa Clarita this fall, and I was holed up hanging out at this CHP checkpoint, and they weren't letting people back into the evacuation zone. So the checkpoint was getting really full of cars, and the cars were full of people and pets and suitcases. And there was this guy there. He was a kid from South LA, and his family had just moved to Santa Clarita, for a bigger house, more space, safer neighborhood. And so he's at his house, and in the middle of the night, and it's dark, right, because SoCal Edison had already cut the power to the house to try to prevent a wildfire. This kid goes outside, and he sees flames, burning down the hillside behind his house. And so his family packs up frantically, they get in their car, and they drive away. And he told me that he had just never imagined that his new neighborhood was in danger of being burned in a wildfire. I mean, there were pools there, there's palm trees, there's cul-de-sacs. It wasn't in the wilderness, it was in suburbia. It was the California dream, and he just never anticipated that it would burn. And I think a lot of us are sort of puzzling over some variation of that question. So, what is climate change going to do to our way of life? And does the California dream have to change? And I find it's helpful to get specific when we're talking about these things, when we're talking about the future in particular. So which is why we're going to start our conversation tonight by talking about the science of climate change. So how much hotter is it going to get? How much drier? Will air quality get worse? What's going to burn and when? And then we'll talk about what those predictions actually mean on the ground, because knowing what we know about the science, we can then talk about the challenges in particular for the Inland Empire. And then in the middle of the session, we'll spend some time answering your questions, so start thinking of them now. And then we will end by talking about solutions, because I find as sort of daunting and overwhelming as the predictions are, there is hope, and there are things we can do, and there are things that people are doing already. So I would like to start with the scientists. So we're going to bring out the two scientists that we have here to talk to you. First person I'd like to bring out is Tim Krantz. He's a professor of environmental studies here at University of Redlands. And I would also like to invite out Kurt Schwabe. He's a professor of environmental economics and policy at UC Riverside. Okay. So before we get into questions for you guys, I wanted to start just by talking about what our climate future might look like. And fortunately, here in California, we have a lot of great scientists working to answer this question as part of the California Climate Change Assessment. The fourth one of these just came out last year. And so here are some key takeaways. So by the year 2100, it could be a lot hotter, especially inland. We could see a lot more extremely hot days, like 70 additional days over 112 degrees in the inland deserts. We're also anticipating the loss of a number of Southern California beaches. And we're anticipating a dwindling snowpack in the Sierra Nevada and the Rockies, which are the headwaters of the Colorado River. And that matters because here in Southern California, we import most of our water from those two places. We are expecting more and longer droughts, but also more periods of extreme wet weather. So those crazy atmospheric rivers that come and dump a ton of water in a short period of time, more of those and more droughts. Now, wet winters followed by extremely hot summers, that's like the worst recipe for a bad wildfire season because all the grass and all the vegetation that grew in the winter dries out in the heat, it bakes, and it becomes fuel for fires. And as we continue building more new homes on the edge of undeveloped land, on the outskirts of cities and towns, it just means more houses at risk of burning. Along with all that, we are also expecting smog to get worse too. So, Tim, that's a lot of numbers, a lot of information, but to me, I kind of feel like the most shocking is the increase in temperature and the number of hot days, especially in places like Redlands. So can you kind of translate that? Like, what will life be like? What will it feel like in the Inland Empire in 2100?
Yes, if I could kind of back up and just talk about the basis of climate disruption and how that works. Basically, the atmosphere and oceans are an energy conveyor belt, and it moves energy from the equator towards the poles via rising air over the equator, and then it descends back down towards the surface of the Earth about 30 degrees north and south of the equator. And those would be the areas where we have the great deserts of the world, the Sahara Desert, the Great Sandy Desert in Australia, the northern Mexico Sonoran Desert. So if you add greenhouse gases to that, it's just adding energy to the system, and that's going to cause the atmospheric circulation to pump more vigorously. Higher highs, lower lows, that means increased wind speeds, and overall increased temperatures, such that the temperatures and the climate of central Baja California is coming our way.
So that's what you're anticipating is what Baja experiences, and actually what aspects of the climate there are you talking about when you say that's coming here?
So they're characterized by a climate that's extremely arid. We would lose our winter wet and be characterized by more extreme heat in the summer months, occasional monsoon rains, but those aren't very effective in terms of getting down into the groundwater. But overall, much hotter temperatures. And so we're seeing this in Australia today. It's the textbook case, where the desert temperatures there just before Christmas exceeded all-time record high temperatures. The expansion of the central part of the Great Sandy Desert in central Australia is expanding towards their coast. Well, we can expect to see that here too.
Okay. So Kurt, you worked on the inland deserts part of the climate assessment. How would you say climate change will affect this region differently than the rest of California?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And first, I want to thank KPCC for putting this timely panel together. And in terms of the climate assessment, the fourth annual climate assessment, the lead author of this, I was one of the authors, was Frances Hopkins, and she did a great job bringing together an interdisciplinary group of researchers to generate this assessment. But in terms of, you think of the Inland Empire, it's a little bit drier, a little bit warmer than most of the rest of California. And so kind of if you think about some numbers and what might we expect, for those of you that like to go to, say, Palm Springs, right now, every year there's probably about 135 days that get over 95 degrees every year. And at the end of the century, under climate change, you're going to see about 180 days that get above 95 degrees there. So, it's just an increase in the number of hot days. And as Emily suggested, we're going to see more intense and frequent droughts. We're going to see more flooding. We're going to see more wildfires. And this is kind of as a business as usual setting. And we're going to see stress on both our managed and unmanaged systems. So if you talk to any doctor, you talk to an engineer, what does stress result in? Stress results in things breaking down in negative impacts. So you're going to see stress on our ecosystems and on species. So if you go out the Joshua Tree, you might see the desert tortoise potentially going extinct. You might see impacts on the Joshua Tree going extinct. If you think about the electricity sector, the transportation sector, the water sector, they'll all be under significant stress. And I can go into more detail later on if we want time.
Well, and maybe just a follow-up. So which of those predictions, more hot days, hotter temperatures, this sort of weather whiplash, which are scientists most confident about, and where is there the most uncertainty, would you say?
Right. So typically, if you look at most of the climate change models and the scientists that research this, they say this region and California in general, we're going to experience warmer climate. So I think there's consensus out there that it's going to get warmer. And as Emily suggested, around 9 to 14 degrees warmer by the end of the century. In terms of precipitation, that's an interesting one because overall, the precipitation might not change in terms of the total annual precipitation or average over so many years, but the events are going to get wetter and more intense, and there's become less predictable. So you're going to get these really quick flash, monsoons or what do we call them? Atmospheric rivers that are coming down, and obviously you have to have some significant planning to deal with these in advance. So the science is there's consensus in terms of it's going to become hotter, it's going to become more arid, and it's going to be wetter wet seasons and drier dry seasons.
Okay, great. So continuing on, I wanted to bring out our next panelist to talk more about kind of what the science will mean for the Inland Empire, what are some challenges. So I'd like to welcome out Andrea Vidare. She's a policy analyst for the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice in Jurupa Valley. Thanks. And Jonathan Parfrey, who's the executive director of Climate Resolve. They're a nonprofit that works with local governments on climate solutions. Thanks. And Jonathan also worked on the LA region of the climate assessment. So Andrea and Jonathan, I want to ask both of you, what would you say your biggest concern is for kind of a climate changed future in the Inland Empire?
Okay, I really like the title of today's talk, which is the IE going to be livable in 2100, which is in 80 years? And when I read that, my immediate thought was no, because there are parts in the Inland Empire where it's not livable right now, right? We have concentrations of people living inside the Inland Empire where they're dealing with pollution every day, affecting their bodies and their lives. And we're having a lot of cases where people just have premortality, right, in the region. And so thinking about 2100, I think about how that's going to exacerbate if we don't do anything. I think about the situation now, and I think about people that are suffering now, and I think about how in a couple of years, if we don't really do something about it, we could be seeing this happen all over the region and not just in pockets.
Okay, great. What would you say, Jonathan?
Well, the premise of this discussion is what's going to happen in the Inland Empire in 80 years. And the statistics that you have are absolutely true given our business as usual scenario. But if we're able to mitigate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, we can actually stabilize the temperature in the Inland Empire. So that 8 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit is a scary number. But if we do the right thing and we're able to reduce our emissions, I think it would stabilize at maybe 4 or 5 degrees. So the thing that we're really concerned about is making this so apocalyptic that people just throw up their hands and walk away. And the reality is we do have tools at our disposal to actually take on some of that added warming. For example, in Los Angeles, we changed the building code so that every new or refurbished roof has to be a cool roof. And we're now experimenting with cool streets. and enhancing the tree canopy in our poorest communities where there are very few trees as a way of cooling down the city. And those are tools that could be replicated everywhere.
So actually going off of that, and I do want to talk to you more about some of like the great climate policies you've seen cities enact towards the end, but obviously there can be barriers to enacting some of these kinds of policies. And so, Jonathan, what do you see when you're trying to work with cities and counties to get a cool roofs policy in, I'm just making this up, in Riverside or in Redlands? Like, what are some of the barriers sometimes that local officials have to doing things like this?
Well, currently we have a mindset that working on climate change is an added cost, that we have our public works budget, we have our police budget, our fire budget, and we think those things are just going to stay the same. But with climate change, we're going to see more fire. We're going to see more paramedics. We're going to see greater impacts on our public health services. And so the investments that we make today can save us money into the future. And we have to have that forward-thinking approach. And I think when we have good economists like our friend here from UC Riverside, we can make that case to policymakers so that they'll realize these investments actually will save money over the long haul.
So, Andrea, you work a lot with logistics, and obviously transportation is like the largest portion of our greenhouse gas emissions in California. Logistics, transportation is huge in the Inland Empire. How would you say that this region's dependence on logistics makes it difficult to pass climate policies locally?
I think it makes it difficult because we're telling people you have to either choose a job or you have to choose like being able to breathe. And we're given that ultimatum instead of saying, why can't we have both? Why can't we find a sustainable balance with the economic development in the region so that we're not just putting all our eggs in one basket? I mean, I think there's a problem of diversification of employment in the Inland Empire. I think we focused a lot in one area, in one sector, and unfortunately that's the sector that's actually contributing to this problem. And so I think in the region, we have to really figure out how do we mitigate what we have right now, because I think if you ask anyone out here, you would say, yeah, there's a lot of logistics growth. There's a lot of warehouses in the region. There's a lot of trucks, and we are on the way to electrifying it, which would cut those emissions down, but we've got a couple more years left. Are we gonna continue growing? We need to have a bigger plan, a sustainable plan, and I think that's sometimes what's lacking from a lot of cities and governments in the region is they're thinking immediately, how can we get jobs and how can we get people working? And then once you start uncovering those layers and you find out, man, these aren't really the jobs that we needed, right? These aren't really paying the things that we want, and we're actually using more of our money on different things, right? So yeah.
Okay. So Kurt, I know we've talked a lot about water, you and I have, and so I wanted to ask, I mean, California just came through the worst drought in 500 years. How did you find that cities and water suppliers coped? And are you worried how they'll do in the future under a scenario where we have, more frequent droughts and more frequent years of very wet weather? What do you think will happen?
Yeah, there's certainly some significant challenges coming down the pipeline in terms of water. The supply from the Colorado River is going to likely go down by about 35%. That provides about a third of our water in Southern California. The snowpack in the Sierras, which provides a significant amount of water, is becoming more rain, and the precipitation is falling more as rain versus snow, and we don't have this 21st century infrastructure to capture that. So we're going to be losing supplies there too. So the future looks challenging. In terms of talking with water agencies, local, regional, state, there are some very good reasons, and going back to what kind of Jonathan suggested, very good reasons to think that if we make the right choices now and make the right investments, we can reduce and mitigate those impacts quite significantly. So the water agencies are doing a lot, and the state is starting to do a lot more in terms of providing the push and the investments we need to make to deal with this increase in water scarcity in the future. So groundwater supplies, conservation, groundwater remediation, increasing storage. There's a whole litany of investments that local, regional, and state agencies are making.
So you're saying that the system we have was kind of built for a different climate scenario, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So, our system was built given a certain type of runoff, and that runoff's going to change under climate change because it gets warmer, and that those rainfall events come less frequently but more intense, and we just don't have the capacity right now to capture that water and convey it to where it's supposed to be. So that has to be a significant investment that the state makes, and that's supported by the voters.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the issues are that there's all these sunk costs we're already invested in getting electricity a certain way or getting water a certain way. And Tim, you and I talked about some of the electrical infrastructure and some of the barriers to moving towards renewables or moving towards more reliable electrical systems, especially with wildfires. What do you think should happen there? What are some of the challenges with our electrical infrastructure?
Right. The 9 of the 10 worst wildfires in California have been since 2003. And the most disastrous have been in 2017 and 18, just the last couple of years after our extreme droughts. And the cause of those fires was public or private utility companies' power lines coming down in wind events that are associated with the fire, and then they spark, and those have become the sources. And that comes in Southern California. All of our big energy projects are out in the desert, and then they have to transmit that through the passes where it's exactly where the windiest conditions are. As opposed to, an obvious solution to that would be distributed energy on rooftops, to where if we generated more solar energy on rooftops, then we wouldn't need the distribution lines. The problem is that with private utility companies, of course, they can't sell that to you in the same way that they would, with their own generated power. And so we have sort of an industrial reluctance to go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like, I don't know if you all relate to this, I feel like the thing that seems most pressing to me, the most tangible in the future is heat out here. I mean, I know that there's other things that we know they're happening, like we know air pollution might get worse, but the heat is like this oppressive thing that you feel. And so, Jonathan, what do you think, are there some sort of lesser, well-known, less obvious downsides of increased heat beyond like what we feel and what we experience? Like we talked a little bit about some like spread of disease.
Yes, so the mosquitoes we have these exotic mosquitoes that are now in California that didn't used to be here, the Aedes aegypti mosquito that can bring dengue fever. Also, West Nile mosquito, a different mosquito, can also be found in California now. It didn't used to be here. Lyme disease spreads with ticks, and their distribution has increased with climate change. So you don't have these really cold winters that kill off those vectors. But there are other effects too. So let's say you're in a home that you require a lot of air conditioning and it's just oppressively hot all the time, but closer to the ocean, it's like that's nature's air conditioner. And so there are people who might think, maybe Hawthorne isn't that bad after all, and they may want to relocate. So you could have the warming changing property values, where areas that maintain a lot of heat become less desirable and areas that are cooler become more desirable. So that's just another indirect effect of warming, in addition to health impacts and air quality impacts. The hotter it gets, the more ozone there is.
Well, and about the health impacts, so Kurt, I know that's something you've studied. What are you concerned about in particular with increased heat and vulnerable people in particular?
Right. So thanks. Good question. We did a study where we looked at the impacts of extreme heat on health as measured by birth weights and as measured by mental illness. And the idea that, when you think about the benefits and costs of climate mitigation, often these health effects aren't quantified. But you imagine a low birth weight baby has a whole lifetime of additional costs that they confront. And so we wanted to start to put some numbers on that so it gets more attention. And so we find that, as you kind of expect, that the hotter areas that experience extreme heat, you see lower birth weights. And what we also find, kind of relating to water policy, though, is that those areas that are in regions with more secure water supplies, actually that effect diminishes a bit. So the idea is that the heat affects you both physically if you go out and work, that affects you that way, but it also affects the resources if your income's dependent on heat, like agriculture, which is going to be affected by the heat, but also just the idea that people might get stressed about losing a job, and that stress can cause lower birth weights. So we see that effect, and then we also see that when it comes to mental illness, the real impact is nighttime heat. So do you get a reprieve from the heat at night? It's not necessarily the daytime heat that affects mental illness, at least in our, one study doesn't define a theory or illustrate a point, but we find that during the nighttime heat waves are the impact that seems to affect mental illness the greatest.
And Andrea, what are you already seeing in terms of workers and heat? I know there's not currently, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's not an indoor heat standard yet in California, right, for workplaces, right?
I believe that they are working on an
Okay.
indoor heat standard, and I think it actually might have passed. I think
Oh,
federally
great.
they don't have an indoor heat standard. For the longest time, especially in the region, if you're familiar, you're right, there's a lot of warehouses, and in these warehouses they didn't have an indoor heat standard. So as it gets really hot in the summer, those places are closed up, they don't have windows, and so it's really been a push in the past couple of years to get ventilation, to get fans, just so that the workers in this region can have a little bit of relief from that type of heat. And another, I think, effect or impact from the heat that I don't think we think about a lot of times with like the workforce in our region is like the people dealing with these containers that are coming in and out on these trucks. So the first people to really open those up and make it possible for you to get same day shipping or make it possible for you to have stuff in your like stores, those people are the first ones reacting with these containers in the trucks, and those can get extremely hot and cause like second-degree burn as they're opening them or if they lean on them. It's something that will progressively get worse, right, as we think about climate change. And really quickly, I didn't know about the low birth, and how the heat can more so affect them. But I've also, when we talk about air pollution, we also know like air pollution is linked to low birth weight. So I think about this like endless cycle of like you're living in a polluted community. We have women that are pregnant and unfortunately, right, can get impacted by that, and they have a low birth weight child. And then we have this heat, right, this ongoing heat, and how it's this cycle, right, that we have to break at some point.
Mm-hmm. So, Tim, I know you have studied a lot, in particular the Salton Sea, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how what happens at the Salton Sea affects, people living both alongside it, but also, hundreds of miles, tens of miles away, and what you expect to happen with that super complex place in the future.
Yeah, the Salton Sea is kind of a textbook case of a whole bunch of things that can go wrong that are going to be exacerbated by climate change. Most of the water into the Salton Sea is from the Colorado River, and the states have argued amongst themselves about who gets how much of that. And so California has to reduce its take from the Colorado River according to an interstate settlement agreement that it was adjudicated by the Supreme Court, so it doesn't go any higher than that. But basically, there's less water into the sea, which will cause the sea's shore to contract by huge amounts. We're predicting on the order of 140 square miles of exposed lakebed sediments. These sediments are super, super small, less than 2 millionths of a meter, so small that if you breathe them, once they become airborne with dust storms, you can't expel them from your lungs. They're so small they'll perfuse through your lung tissue into your bloodstream, carrying with them really nasty chemicals, cadmium, selenium, arsenic, and these dust particles are going to travel whichever way the wind blows. So Phoenix could be breathing this. Mexicali is right next door. Or if the wind turns around, we could be affecting breathing some of this here. In fact, already, just in the last 2 years, we've had 2 major dust events that were unreported here in the Inland Empire. And yet, I remember waking up one morning and looking up at the mountains in the middle of summer, and so it shouldn't have been foggy, but there was this gray haze, and it was a dust storm from the Salton Sea.
Wow, so already that's starting to happen.
Yeah, it's happening now, and those conditions will only get much worse as air temperatures increase. Out in the Imperial Valley, we're expecting 180 plus days a year, over 105. So It's going to be pretty wicked.
Okay. So we have some time for audience questions. We have a lot of time, actually. We want to answer your questions. So my colleague Daphne is going to come around with the microphone. So if you can get a hold of her, remember a question ends with a question mark. So please have something to ask. And I'll let Daphne hand the mic off.
Hi, my name is Bruce Laycook, and my question is, since we're going to be getting more monsoonal type rain, what can municipalities do in terms of building codes? What can water agencies do in terms of catch basins and those kinds of things? And what can homeowners do on their own premises in order to capture that water? Because when it's a monsoon, we know it's all going down the drain and it's going to end up in the Pacific Ocean. And if it's a bad one, parts of Orange County are going to be interesting places.
That sounds like a Kurt and Jonathan question. Do you guys want to try that one?
Well, Australia is going through some really hard times right now. And they also went through a terrible drought. And one of the things that they implemented is that homeowners were obligated to get cisterns, and not just a rain barrel. A rain barrel will fill up like that, but a cistern could be a water supply that could last for a very long time, and to capture some of that water. So if a local water district wanted to offer an incentive to homeowners to capture that, that could be very interesting. But in a much more macro way, the state of California is currently considering a climate resilience bond measure. Eduardo Garcia, assembly member here in the Coachella Valley, is the lead author of the bill that I believe will get through to Governor Newsom. A lot of interest in water resiliency. So as communities are able to capture water and then store water, infiltrate it, I could see a lot of funding potentially becoming available if our legislature puts forward these dollars. But again, we're going to need the economists to say, that's a good use of money because it'll save us money. And that's where you come in, Kurt.
Thanks. That's a great question. So two things you want to do is you want to slow down those rains, right? So you can imagine better forest management in the San Bernardino, say. And so when the rain comes, it's not a denuded landscape, and the trees and such reduce the impact of the rain and catch it and slow it down so it can be used throughout the whole year. And then you need storage. And it turns out that surface storage is really expensive. And people don't like to give up their land nearby for another big reservoir. So what the state's finding is that we have this incredible capacity with groundwater right now. So whereas most of our surface water storage sites are near full right now. So if we had a monsoon rain right now, you're exactly right. We're going to lose a lot of it to the ocean. But our groundwater aquifers, they have a lot of capacity. But we don't necessarily have the conveyance system yet to capture that water and convey it into those aquifers. So that's, I think, one of the large priorities the state and the regional water districts are focusing on is how you build the conveyance system and the capturing system to convert that or take that water and move it to the aquifers.
I'd like to add one other thing for water conservation, and that would be the incentive to rip out one's lawns and replace it with drought-tolerant landscaping. One of the biggest water wasters is a lawn. I look at a lawn and I see, for example, in the Coachella Valley, the potential evaporation off of those golf courses out there, and there's 200 of them in Coachella Valley, is 2 meters of water. That's 7 feet of water a year. And I drive across and I look at our lawns here, even on the University of Redlands campus, and I'm picturing 6 feet deep of water that's just being evaporated back out into the atmosphere. So replacing our lawns with more drought-tolerant native landscaping would be an easy, low-hanging fruit for water conservation.
Great, thank you. Do we have another question? Daphne?
Hey there. Some say that we should look towards market solutions for a way out of this problem that we have. Given that we have something like 100 companies that produce over 70% of global emissions. Can we really trust the companies who have created this problem to solve the problem?
Andrea, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah,
In particular with cap and trade, maybe? Or
Yeah,
however
sure.
you want to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all weigh in a little bit. I don't see that really working for the communities that are most vulnerable. I don't see that working for the communities that are like most susceptible to climate change or even to the impacts right now of air pollution. I think dumping money into communities to mitigate a pollution that's already there doesn't really solve the problem. I think that pollution still exists, and I think programs like cap and trade that said, and it never really was a cap, right? It was a program that said, hey, here's your cap for polluting. Anything more than that, you're gonna have to pay. Cool, that money comes into some of our communities, but what does that money really come into? Does it come into like actually changing the polluting sort? Like, no, we still have water contamination, we still have air contamination, and they're just paying it off, right? And even though it's coming into some of our communities and we are seeing mitigation, do we really have the time to be waiting for that type of mitigation? You know, are we really in that place? I mean, we heard these experts talk on stage today about how severe this issue is really, right? I don't think those market solutions so far have been working for us.
Kurt, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, and so I think there's kind of maybe two discussions going on here. So I would have to say that I am a fan of markets, but well-functioning and planned markets. So I think what Andrea's pointing out is that a lot of times you get these markets where you leave open hotspots. So you have too broad of a market, so all the polluting industries go to an area with low property values and in disadvantaged communities. And so that's just not a very well put together market in that sense, because if you're going to use some type of approach to reduce pollution, markets are a cost-effective way to do it. Not in every case. So if you need to do it right away, you don't want to wait on a market like Andrea said. You'd want to use kind of a more command and control style approach. But if you do have a chance, and it's not something that needs to be done right away, markets are a very cost-effective way. There are externalities or issues associated with them. But in terms of this kind of balance, you can't stop pollution. Right? So as I tell my students, it's not are we going to have pollution or not. It's how much pollution are we going to have, right? And you got to balance that, in terms of the cost of pollution and the cost of reducing pollution versus economic development and all these other factors. So I agree that in many cases, so going back to the initial question, you don't leave it up to the businesses to set up the market. You have a regulator, a well-informed regulator that says, this is the type of air quality that we want here, here, and here, and here. Now let's set up the market and make sure we maintain that air quality. And if it goes beyond it, there are severe penalties such that it's in their best interest, businesses' interest, not to pollute over that level.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question? Daphne, thank you.
Hello, my name is Janie, and I'm a sophomore here at the university. And I have a couple of questions.
Maybe pick your favorite one.
Thank you. Okay, yes. So you mentioned that we're going to, in the near future, decrease the amount of water that is supplied from the Colorado River. Where are we going to get our water then? And how are we just going to some people build some kind of pipeline to get water from a different place, a even farther place? And what will that be just as bad in terms of pollution? And how do we fix that? I feel like more and more time goes by, it feels more and more like a climate apocalypse.
Thank you for the question. Tim, you want to say something? And then Kurt?
Sure. Water is definitely the Achilles heel for us here in Southern California. 2/3 of the people in the state live in the south, and 2/3 of the rain falls in the north. And so our dependence on Colorado River water is very tenuous, to say the least. Even the water that is allocated to California, there's not that much water in the river to meet all of the state allocations. So we can't really rely on that. The water that we get from Northern California comes from runoff from the Sierras and what have you, and is delivered all the way to the south through the California aqueduct system. To the extent that climate change means less snowpack, that's less groundwater recharge and less runoff that's going to feed that California aqueduct. So we've got to learn how to get by with less, how to manage our groundwater systems better, because that's the only reliable system that we've really got here in the South.
Right, and to follow up on that, and Tim brought up a different issue regarding conservation. So as an economist, when I think about this, I don't necessarily think about supply, I think about scarcity. And scarcity is kind of the demand, the difference between demand and supply. So if you want to reduce scarcity, you can increase supply, you can reduce demand, or you can do some combination of the both. So as you point out, water supplies, because of changes in runoff, are likely to go down. But there are things we can do to augment the water supply through reuse, recycling. So you think about the groundwater replenishment system in Orange County. It takes our wastewater. My kids love this when they think about flushing the toilet. Our wastewater goes down to Orange County. They treat it, they stick it in the ground, then they pull it out, clean it, and it becomes drinking water for 200,000 households. So feel good about yourself, right, if you're living in this region.
And when
right?
you watch an Angel game and you see the waterfall in the background, just think that's recycled water.
From you. And so in that sense, you think about, as Tim pointed out, we get 4.4 million acre-feet of water from the Colorado River. We can recycle. We're letting 1 million acre-feet go out to the ocean right now. So if we recycle that, that helps augment our water supply quite significantly. So that's how you augment the water supply, through recycling, and reduce demand through conservation measures that Tim brought up before.
But we have to do it the right way, because cholera is bad.
Correct.
Hashtag
yes,
cholera
has
is
to be
bad.
done very well, and yeah.
So actually, we're gonna switch to talking about some of the solutions, and if we have time at the end, you're welcome to come talk to the folks on the panel. But that was a really great segue into, like, how can we feel less overwhelmed? How can we have hope about the future? How can we not just go home and hide in the closet? So, Andrea, I wanted to ask you in particular, like, I know you work a lot on state policies, so sort of what state policies have you most excited right now? What state climate policies or proposals for policies?
Well, I know the Green New Deal has just come out for California, and it's kind of, it'll be a template for us to think about how do we, how do we both bring labor and the environment together to try to reshape the way that our economy works so that it's not so extractive and it's actually regenerative, and how do we make sure markets are controlled and that we actually have a plan for the future? So that's a really exciting one. And I'm also excited about all of the electrification bills. From the region, we know, like, we're in this air pollution crisis we're in, one of the ways to cut that off will be electrification.
And you're talking about, like, electric cars, electric buses.
Yeah, and then electric trucks, which I get really excited about because there's a lot of them here.
Why do you like electric trucks so much?
We like them because, they cut the diesel pollution off, right? And there's so many communities here suffering from diesel pollution in their homes and in their communities, and we know that they're, like, literally dying from it, dying from diesel being a known carcinogen. And we know that we have to electrify it, so it's a win-win, right? It's a win for, our climate goals, and it's also a win for, like, people that are suffering right now. I'm also excited about just some of the local policies as well. I think we are trying to figure out ways to regulate some of the industries so that we can get more rooftop solar on all of these different industries in the region. And I think that's the type of stuff that we're ready to move forward in.
And Jonathan, can you give some examples of kind of your, I don't know if inspiring is the right word, but policies that have been enacted that you are really excited about and you think could be applied more broadly?
Sure. I almost wish the lights were on because I'd like to quiz the audience, but how many people in this audience know that the state of California has a law that says that we're going to be at 100% renewable electricity within a couple decades? And by 2030, Southern California Edison is going to be at 80% defossilized fuel, so it'll be clean fuel that's coming into our households, 80%. We used to be 100% bad just like 15 years ago. So this is a huge leap forward. But if we had the pie chart from the California Air Resources Board, and we could all see that right now, what it would tell us, the big elephant in the room, where we're getting worse and not better, electricity in the slice of that pie is only 13% of our greenhouse gas emissions, of our contribution to these problems that we've been talking about. But transportation, what comes out of a tailpipe, is 45%. And then you have to add another 10% that's just the waste coming out of refineries. And so we have to take on transportation. That is the most important thing. And so what I find inspiring are these efforts in the state of California to build affordable housing near transportation. It sounds like a small thing, but if we kind of think about the way that we're designing our cities and we make our communities more walkable, more bikeable, more accessible to public transportation, we'll get the social benefits of getting to know our neighbors a little bit more. Maybe that's scary for some people, but I think it could be a good thing. But at the same time, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that way. Listen, I love electric cars. They're wonderful. But we have to have other tools in the toolkit, and that is planning. And that's something that we can all do. We're all members of a city. We can all go to our city council. We can support those measures that create density along transportation so that we don't have to jump in the car every 2 seconds.
And Tim, you work on local land use planning in San Bernardino County, right? Can you talk a little bit about, in particular, things you're seeing with regards to wildfire and new development that you think is a step in the right direction?
Yes, I sat on the County Planning Commission for most of the 80s and into the early 90s. And during that time, we experienced the Panorama Fire in the San Bernardino foothills. And the fire burned down from the chaparral and the natural foothill vegetation into the homes, and then it went home to home. The homes became the fuel, and the sparks would get up into the attics and then go and burn the roof off, and then it would get the next home down. And much like the disastrous fires that we've seen up at in Paradise and elsewhere. So some simple solutions came from that, where simply to close your eaves so that they don't get sparks up in the attic was so simple and so inexpensive to do.
As part of the building code, do you mean?
Yes, so changing building codes, especially on the urban wildlands boundaries, to have less flammable or inflammable exteriors and roofing. So that's a very simple one, and it promotes a whole new class of jobs and construction jobs in refitting these homes. And it's not very expensive, so I see a future in a building boom there. Also to modify our green belts along the edges of the urban wildlands interface. We have many communities in the mountains, Big Bear, Lake Arrowhead, Crestline, and they want to save the trees, so they'll build their homes and patio decks right around the tree itself. They should have to take that tree out rather than have literally the candle wick sticking up out of your porch. So we're seeing that up in the Big Bear area and throughout the San Bernardino National Forest, where there's this safe space kind of a project where they're removing some of the brush certain distances from homes.
And Kurt, I know the gentleman that asked the question about water conservation, just to kind of follow up on that, are we still seeing, are we using as much water as we were before, or is that something that's getting better? Are we getting better at water conservation, and how can we continue to improve in that area?
Yeah, excellent and really important question. So actually, if you look at our water use in municipal California over the last 2 decades, it's actually gone down by 1%. Even though the population in California has, since in the last 2 decades, has gone up by 5 million people. Our actual urban water use has gone down by 1%. In the agricultural sector, our water use has gone down by about 0.33% over the last 2 decades. So those changes are due to efficiency, improvements in water use efficiency, and they're often being funded by a lot of the local water agencies and the state to encourage and lower the costs of people adopting these efficiency measures. But in terms of where you probably get your most return in terms of water savings right now is through outdoor irrigation reduction. So as Tim brought up, either converting your landscapes to more drought tolerant or Mediterranean friendly or California friendly landscaping, or improving your irrigation efficiency. So you can get a long ways just by irrigating based on the grass or the plant's needs. And so, 60% of our water use in urban environments is from irrigation, and that's really where the gains can be made at low cost.
So, Andrea, about air pollution, are you seeing, do you have examples of cities or maybe companies that are taking steps to reduce their diesel pollution to protect workers and neighbors from that kind of pollution? Or do you have any examples of things that sort of give you hope in the local air pollution realm?
Give me a second.
You can be honest if you're not, but if you do, let's hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will. I mean, I think we can respect some of the companies in the industries that come here, and they come here with good faith and trying to really promote and uplift the community that they're in, and they're really good neighbors. I guess one thing that was exciting, and it unfortunately flopped, but in Riverside County, they tried to implement something called the Good Neighbor Policy. And it was just creating this buffer 1,000 feet from some of these warehouse facilities from sensitive receptors. So let's not have trucks going in front of parks and daycares and schools and homes, right? Unfortunately, that didn't really work. There was different people, stakeholders weighed in, and they ended up moving it to, I think, 300 feet, and then even then it was an opt-in kind of measure, so then it didn't actually really happen. So we didn't really have that type of protection, like distance protection from some of these polluting sources. And so although it was a good conversation starter, I think if we can see more of that, and we can see more companies respecting, maybe we shouldn't be coming into communities where people are just trying to recreate, right? Let's stay in community, let's stay in the parts of the city that are industrial. Let's make sure that we are good employers, that we're taking care of our community, our workers, we're allowing them to unionize, we're being fair in the community, giving our fair share into taxes, not just property taxes, but also sales taxes, right? And how can they be good partners, right? So we're not just seeing so much extraction. I've yet to see a good example, but I'm hopeful.
Okay. And Jonathan, I think one thing that, like, I'm a renter, a lot of people are renters. A lot of the times it feels like these actions that individual people can do are more for homeowners, like put solar on your roof or like put a charger in your garage. And it's like, what if you don't have a garage? Like, what if you don't control your roof? So what are things that people who live in dorms or renters can do to feel like they're actually, part of the solution and not the problem?
Multifamily units, that's really a tough one. In fact, in the utility industry, they call it the split incentive, where you have the person who owns the refrigerator as the apartment owner, but the person paying the utility bill is the person in the home. So you could have a decrepit 1958, refrigerator, but the person having to pay for that terrible refrigerator is the renter. And so these are issues that I think have to be solved by public policy. Now, as a renter, you could also buy into the utilities to get to 100% solar. There right now are cities that are getting into these CCAs, community choice aggregators, where they're able to go out for the city, make the city the utility that buys the electricity, and go to 100% renewables. So these are things, as a renter, you could say, well, I might not have solar on my roof, but 100% of my electricity is also renewable. And I believe Southern California Edison has a program where you could buy 100% renewables. And I know that even Southern California Gas Company has a petition before the PUC to be able to deliver 100% biogas to homeowners if they elect to purchase that. We'll see if the PUC approves that. But those are options that, as consumers, you can also do.
Okay. So, Tim, this one's a little out of left field, but I know you've worked a lot with plant communities here in the San Bernardino Mountains, and I was wondering if you're seeing evidence of adaptation or resiliency, or how you think things that give you hope when you sort of look at how plants are adapting to the climate changed environment.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not seeing much in the way of climate resiliency with the plants.
So this should have been in the problem section.
Right, this should have been in the problem section, because we are seeing the impacts, as we are throughout the mountains of California, with these severe droughts and tree die-offs, and again, poor construction practices where you're allowed to build too close to the tree, right up next to it with your foundation, which weakens the tree's ability to pump sap and water to push out bark beetles, and then you get these big bark beetle explosions. We have 140 some odd million standing dead trees in California forest right now, which exacerbates our fire situation. So one of those solutions to that would be a green forest strategy that goes ahead and removes those and would forcibly cause homeowners or developers to take the tree if they're building too close to it. Don't just pave over it and around it, but then have to replant other trees to take its place at, say, a 4-to-1 ratio or a 5-to-1 ratio. And so there's no net loss there of the trees themselves. Plant those trees in bioswales that catch the runoff off your rooftop, and you've solved part of the irrigation problem too. So those are some of the easy modifications that we could make in our native communities, plant communities.
Tim, are you seeing refugia in the San Bernardino Mountains?
There are some.
What is that?
Refugium for the climate refugium. So there are some kind of uniquely in our San Bernardino, San Gabriel mountains, our mountains run east-west. That means they have a south-facing side that's really hot, but they also have a north-facing slope on each ridge that's cool. And so we are seeing that some plants are able to hang on and plant communities on that cooler slope where otherwise they may not be able to.
So this is sort of broad, but I just wanted to ask each of you what gives you hope, and answer that any way you would like. Do you want to start, Kurt?
Thank you. Yes, and I'll use up all the really good ideas here. Well, hearing the student in the audience, and what we need is we need an informed public. And even if you're a renter, you can vote, and you can vote for your water boards, you can vote for your city planners, your utility boards, and local and regional state Congress people. So that's something that I think what gives me hope is I think that as I teach students, I see a more informed public coming up. I also see the water agencies considering the idea that they can't operate in silos anymore. Right? And the state, through its climate bill that is coming out, that the legislators thinking a $4.2 billion climate bill, a large part of that is kind of this idea that you have to have integrated planning for emergency management. So if you think about what Australia is going through right now, we don't want to be in that situation, or we want to reduce the risk of that happening and not being prepared. So it's preparing with other agencies and other people, and it's being informed, and I see reasons to be optimistic in all of those.
Andrea, do you want to talk about what gives you hope?
Sure. I think, it's the people that we get to meet through the work that we do. It's the community, really. It's people taking this issue not because it's going to affect them, but it's because it affects, I hear this all the time, it's because it's going to affect my grandchildren, it's going to affect my kids, or even youth and young people right now who are worried about like their future selves and their future families, right? So I think it's really the people, and I think it's the people that are coming in and taking this issue as their own, and they're going out on the streets, right? They're going out and they're being vocal about it. I think that gives me a lot of hope to see people not only at some of these manifestations, right, where they're like angry publicly, but it's also like door knocking and meeting their neighbors and telling people about the issue and really caring about their local community out here in the Inland Empire. I think that's really what gives me hope, are these people that even after working, even after taking care of the home, they find some time to come out and like spread the word and go out and tell an elected official that they're upset, or go out and fly to the Capitol and tell these representatives what's really happening here. They give me hope.
Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you for the question. California is, if it were its own independent country, would be the 5th largest economy on the planet. And we've been reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's been this big lie that this is costly and it's going to hurt the economy, where the fossil fuel companies have been externalizing their costs on the rest of us for decades, if not centuries. So what gives me hope is that California, if it sticks to the plan, can be a model for other states and other nations. Not to do the right thing. I don't want other countries or states to follow us because we're virtuous. I want them to follow us because we're leading into the future and that we're optimistic about our future because we've done the right thing and we're enthusiastic about what tomorrow might bring.
Okay, Tim, what gives you hope?
We have all of the solutions in place technologically, renewable energy technologies, et cetera, new building strategies for making more energy efficient homes. But what really gives me hope at the end of the day is all of my students. I've seen this tremendous change in the last 10 years in my student engagement and concern, and you guys are out there and ready to take on the world, and let's do this.
All right.
And KPCC gives me hope.
We didn't ask him to say that. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all for coming. So Tim Krantz, Kurt Schwabe, John Parfrey, and Andre Vidare. Of course, thank you to University of Redlands, Jennifer Dobbs and her team here. Thank you for hosting us. And thank you to all the people you can't see in the dark on the sides, the KPCC in-person team. And will you guys be available afterwards if people have questions? Okay, great. So thank you so much. That's a night.